Hello everyone and welcome back. Today what I'm going to be talking about is analysing your qualitative data in order to make sense of it and in order to report on your projects. So it assumes that by this point you've finished your interviews, you've generated data using focus groups or some other way, perhaps with feminist memory work or some other qualitative process of generating data. There's a fundamental difference apart from the numbering part of the quantitative data between quantitative and qualitative, and that is that often when you do quantitative data, you do your organisation beforehand. So if you think about the idea of a survey, you've organised your questions, therefore you've already done your coding or your categorising, and so it's quite easy to organise your data afterwards. It's just going to fall into place. That's very different when you do qualitative data. You do your organisation, your categorisation, you're thinking about themes, etc. after you've gathered your data. In most cases, if you were doing very structured interviews, that might be a little bit different because that would be more aligned to the way you gather data for a survey. But for most qualitative data, and certainly that generated via interviews and focus groups, you do your organisation or you're thinking about the analysis of the data afterwards. And analysing really just means to think about the way in which the information is structured, how you can break it down to make it usable chunk-sized pieces of information to make it make sense for everybody else looking at it and for you too. So that's what we're talking about today. Now, often it can be quite overwhelming, and I've certainly felt that way myself many times when I've been presented with a large amount of data, and you will have in the best projects a great deal of data, and it feels overwhelming, very much like the metaphor of this children's room that I've got in the picture here. So if you just think about the fact that you've always already been doing lots of organisation, perhaps of your own rooms or other people's spaces. You go into a messy space and then you organise and get it organised, and that's what you're doing with qualitative analysis. You're taking what feels like a lot of information and then transforming that into an order that makes sense to you. And I guess I'd just like to stress that the way in which this particular room is organised might be different if it was belonging to somebody else. And that's the same for your data as well. What you're doing is your view of the data. Somebody else might use that exact same data and find a different view or have a different perspective of it, even if it's only very slightly. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that it will feel overwhelming at times to be presented with a whole lot of qualitative data. However, you have been there before in your life where you've had lots to do, needed to get something organised, even if it was a bedroom, and you've been able to do that in some way. So the idea of analysing your qualitative data is really about making sense of it, making meaning from what you've generated or collected. It contributes fantastically to knowledge about our society and can even contribute to changing policy and practices. For example, there's a young woman doing a PhD at the moment, and she's looking at homeless provisions for young people, and I know that the way in which people have set up these homeless facilities is quite different to what the young people have experienced and needed, and therefore once her information gets out and their voices are heard, that will change policies and practices so that people provide housing facilities that are more in line with what young people need. That's one example. There are many, many more about how your research can actually make a difference in the real world. The research process always needs to be rigorous, by which I mean that it has a lot of depth, you do things thoroughly, you make sure that you're reflexive. It should be replicable in that perhaps somebody else can do the same process, because because I might do it differently and my standpoint is different, there might be some differences in the process. However, we're always transparent about what it is that we do, even transparent about making mistakes or learning from our experience. So there's nothing wrong with making mistakes when you're doing research. And if I think about and I'm putting quote marks around it, the hard scientists, they're always happy to be proven wrong because that's something new to be learned as well. And it's a good idea to take that sort of attitude that there's nothing really right and fixed about what it is that we do. It's a learning experience for us, and we learn from other people in the gathering of our data. For me, reflexivity is really crucial. You're the research instrument, really. It's not about the test tubes or whatever, it's about you, and therefore you do affect the outcome of your research. So you need to be thinking about your involvement and be clear about that as well. Even to the extent that people have written articles, I know some colleagues at Flinders University have written about how they were critical of somebody's story, and that was a learning experience for them through reflecting on that. Why were they critical of a woman who, for example, had not left a domestic violence situation? When they were listening to her story, they found themselves saying, and reflected on this together afterwards, they found themselves saying internally, not to her, internally, well, I don't understand why she was there for so long. Why didn't she just leave? When they reflected on that situation later on, they wrote that up into a paper criticising themselves for that approach rather than the woman, and then explored that. And if they hadn't done that, that might have shaped the way in which they recorded that and presented that information later on as a critical analysis of that particular woman's experience. And as I said when I was talking about doing interviews, an interview is the result of an interaction between a researcher and the person being researched. And some people are better at doing research via interviews than other people, and so you can see how that would be quite different. Or you know, if we're doing semi-structured interviews where there's a lot of scope for different responses, then one person might ask one question and elicit quite a different response from another person. So it's not just a one-way thing at all. Interview data generation comes from an interaction, so it pays to remember that as well. Hence why I hesitate when I say around, can we replicate this particular data? We can replicate the process, but you've got different people in there, so it will be slightly different as well. But important to be transparent about the way in which you go about doing your research. So the phases of analysis really are to get kind of organised. You will have done some transcriptions. You need to keep them in a place where you can access them very easily. You've got to think about now, how am I going to keep all of this information stored? These days, I do a lot of that on my computer, so it's stored virtually rather than on shelves. Some of it's on shelves, but a lot of it is stored because I do an interview, that's uploaded to the computer. I've had a transcription done, that's uploaded as well, it's backed up as well, but it's all there in files, but it's all on the computer. So you do need to make sure that you keep all of your information, as I'm sure you already do with lots of other material. Keep that well organised. You also need to familiarise yourself with it, and if you're doing a transcription of an interview or a focus group, then you will be already in that process of getting very familiar with what people have said, and you'll begin to be thinking about it and thinking about some themes and some patterns and some comparisons of different interviews as well. So for me, that actually means listening to the interview again as I'm transcribing, and then once the transcription is done, then I would read that again, and I might make some corrections, grammatical corrections or whatever to that transcription. Then I usually send that out to the person being interviewed, and then it comes back in, and by the time I've read and reread that story, I'm quite familiar with much of the detail. So you need to be familiar with the story or the interview. And then you go through a kind of a coding process and think about some of the themes that are themes or categories that are present in the data as well, so that you can then begin to build. I would be building a research article or a report around some of the ideas that are presenting themselves through. So getting organised, getting familiar, beginning to code the data. And then that coding comes from the generating categories and themes. So ways in which you can do that, you can compare and contrast. You can look for patterns, not just of frequency, but of the significance of something. You can look for the silences. So if I think about look for patterns, one of the patterns that I've found in my foster care research is the number of women who've really been treating children very badly. I call them cruel women for a conference paper that I've given this year. So, and it doesn't matter what role women have been in regard to the children. All of these women have been quite cruel. So there have been stepmothers and foster mothers and birth mothers and aunties. And so that's quite a strong theme running through 13 of my 14 interviews with former foster children. So that's become a theme which I've isolated for one particular paper. And then what I will do as I write up that paper is look for other themes within that. And some ones that I've noticed is that often women have been complicit in the sexual abuse of children, in that they've been aware of it, but they haven't stepped in any way to stop it. So they're kind of in that way, not directly involved, but complicit in that behaviour. But none of the women in this sample have been sexually abusive themselves of children. Another theme that has come through is of abandonment and rejection, sometimes directly, where birth mothers haven't wanted to mother their children, and sometimes that's been implied. A couple of the stories have had people children threatened with having to leave the family home for something if they didn't toe the line usually. So that's one large theme that I found in that data, and then I break that down into small ones. When it comes to searching for silence, the story that I want to tell there is of several years ago, when the whole idea of hijabs and women covering themselves because they identified as Muslims, there was a lot of debate, a lot of conversation happening in the community. And I guess I'm thinking about 6-7 years ago when this was kind of a big deal for the first time. That's not to say we haven't had Muslims in Australia for a long time. We have, but I'm talking about a particular period of debate. And what was going on then was lots of people were talking about the hijab. There were feminists talking about it. There were shock docs talking about it. It seemed like everybody in the community was talking about the women wearing these hijabs, headscarves. But one of my colleagues, again at Flinders University, did an analysis, a media analysis of all of this debate, and discovered that there was an enormous silence, because the one group of people who weren't talking about wearing hijabs were Muslim women. And so you're also looking to try and hear what's not being said in your data as well. And then usually what we're wanting to do is interpret in light of some social theory as well. So in the terms of the Muslim women, then we're looking at the marginalisation again, or the silencing of particular groups in the community. And this is sometimes called an epistemic violence, where there's violence done to a group of people because their knowledge is not included. So lots and lots of social theories, as you will have come across. And so we think about all of this in light of those theories, and sometimes generate new theories ourselves. And then you reread all of that data in light of your interpretations and reflect on that process. And for some academics, that leads to papers on doing research as well. Not just what the findings of the research, but the process of doing the research. So I've talked about thematic analysis, and I'm going to talk a bit about grounded theory as well. I guess the pictures that I've got here of all the shoes and the other diagram is really to suggest to you that there's lots of different ways in which to organise your data. You can have the theme of the shoes, and I might organise shoes in terms of high-heeled shoes or summer shoes and winter shoes. They're all different sorts of themes or different categories that I can use. And on the right-hand side there, I've got different social categories that I might use to look at data, like labour rights, health and safety, human rights, governance, community infrastructure. I could include education, and then there are a whole lot of themes underneath there as well. So there's lots of ways in which you can organise your data. It's not about me being prescriptive at all and telling you how to do it. It's about you working out what makes the most sense from your data. So familiarising yourself. The words that I like to think of are immersion and incubation, where you're repeatedly reflecting on your notes, maybe re-listening your recorded material, rereading of your written material, thinking about what the participant has said, what you've read, in order to discern a pattern. And the image that I've got here is of somebody who puts up lots of post-it notes and puts all of these themes around a particular room. And I know somebody who works just like that. So this I don't. I tend to have all of my themes on documents within my computer, so it's quite invisible to anybody else. But a woman that I know who's a fantastic analyst. She's a super researcher. I love what she does. And what she will do is cover a room with all of these possible themes in order to familiarise herself, in order to try and work out what the pattern might be in the data. So to do a thematic analysis is the most common, and it is about a central idea that runs through the data, but it may be that you have a central idea and then underneath that you have some other ideas, as I've just said, in terms of women who've been cruel to children, and then underneath that I've noticed some other themes running through as well. When I go back to that data, I will find other themes, not just cruel women, so that you can have multiple themes running through your data. It could be predetermined by pre-reading, so you might find that you've done lots of reading. For example, somebody did some research for me around people who've been in state care, and one of the themes that they noticed was that researchers always talk about a psychological theory of attachment theory. So that was a theme that she was looking for in her data because that had come up in the pre-reading that she had done. You make connections between what's being said and some broader ideas. And so if I think back to the women and children, I'm trying to make sense of what's being said by the people who've been felt very badly treated by women, and broader ideas. I'm situating that within a context of a therapeutic approach where we don't blame people for the way in which they behave. We accept that they've probably been very badly treated themselves, as many women have been, but we do ask them to take responsibility for their behaviour, and that's been what I've done so far with that finding of the theme of cruel women in my project. Another example I've got here is the dissatisfaction with university by some men could be because of the particular type of masculinity, a non-hegemonic masculinity on campus, for example. So you connect up the detail at that micro level with some theories which position the data in a much broader context. And the idea of coding really is to chunk down your data, make it smaller, make it more easily managed units. So, and the coding and the categorizing is really just thinking about those themes. You could interchange those words, theme, code, category. As I said, you might have some of those from your literature already, or it may be inductive as emerging from the data itself. And often both of those things go together. Lots of the research that I've done around education, higher education, because there's been so much research on that, often we've found from our literature that the same themes are emerging from our own data. And we've also found a few new ideas as well. So the idea of coding is going through your literature then and then sorting. So you've worked out your themes, or maybe not, maybe you're still in the process of doing that. But it is all about identifying, sorting, highlighting, and you might be down to the level of words, or maybe down to the level of phrases, or maybe down to the level of concepts. So what you're trying to do is group things that you think are alike together, and I stress again, it's your grouping of it. Now, the picture I've got here of all these little bugs is somebody's sorting of this particular phenomenon in the natural world of these little critters. But you're doing, I guess what I wanted to put the image there to stress what you're doing is very similar to somebody who might, an entomologist who's trying to understand the world at the level of bugs. You're doing a similar thing, you're just sorting and categorizing as any scientist sorts and categorizes. When any human being, we all sort and categorize all the time. Think about sorting the whites from the colours when you do your washing, for example, or sorting the clean clothes from the dirty ones. Some useful starting points to be thinking of are ideas, concepts, practices, words and ideas that are in the data. Again, the concepts or ideas that have come from the literature, and your initial research questions again. And again, I've got an image there of sorting, sharks and amphibians and rodents, etc. So human beings are always sorting, and so that's what you're trying to do with your data as well. Just try and get it sorted in a way that makes sense to you. Tools that you need, very simple. You might need some index cards. You might be using that. Might be using a mind map. The colleague that I said who loves to post things all around the room, she tends to like that mind mapping thing. She likes to see it outside of her. Using simple highlights. We've done that on some of our memory work stories. We've just gone through we've had various themes, and then we've just highlighted in the text where those themes are present. You can also use a computer program, which I did for my PhD project, called NVivo. I tend not to use that these days. There was a particular reason why, and I'll come back to that later on about why I'd want a computer program. For a lot of the contemporary research that I do, I don't use it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the memory work project that I've mentioned before and how we went about the initial coding. So if you think again about, you've just got a box of goodies there in the image, and what you're going to do now is take those out and get them sorted. And I want to stress again, you're used to doing this, you've been doing this your entire life, sorting things, and you're not doing anything different in a sense. So when we did our initial coding, we went through and we ended up with a number of codes. So this was a project that I did at Flinders University. It was a memory work project. So people came in, they wrote stories that were directed around an education experience, and then they read those stories out loud. They wrote for about 20 minutes, then they read those stories out loud in the group, and then we analysed the story. And then those of us in the research team, and there were 4 of us, what we then did was analyse the stories further afterwards. So we took some of the analysis from the group, and then we thought about those stories immediately afterwards when we were just reflecting on the experience, and then when we analysed those stories, have the actual data. So these were lots of the themes that we had. There's 10 of those. I won't read through them all because you can do that for yourself. But we ended up with, in actual fact, more than 8 codes. I've listed 8, but if you have a look at the last one, there's a number of there. Now, from that, say 8, what we did was come down into a focused coding. So we had lots and lots to start with. That's quite normal. And then we got focused. And we thought, well, what do those 8 have in common? Can we draw some of those together? And one way in which we did that was to say that there were 3. There was the motivations for women going to university. So these were women from poor backgrounds who were going to university, and they're all first in their family. What support they had for this new venture. You know, if you're the first in your family to go to university, it is a completely new venture in your family, and their efforts in trying to succeed at university. So there were 3 themes that we came down to after analysing our data and starting off with more than 8. So you do an initial coding, and then you get a little bit more focused on it. And I'll leave it there for you to read the detail of that as well. So this is another example of where I've got a transcript written, and this is another way of doing it, and all of the lines of the transcript have a number, and then in this example I've got a bit of the transcript there, and then I have an initial coding, and then I have a first coding. I'll just, for those of you listening, read two examples. So line 21 says, I'm the first in my family to go to university. And so the initial coding there is the family educational history, and then the focus coding comes down to the first generation. The line 52, my dad works at Holden's and my mum works part-time at Woolies. This is an interview with Matt. The initial coding is around social class background, but then the focus coding brings that a little bit deeper down into working class. And so I'll leave you to have a look at the interview with Matt and the interview with Ben as another way in which coding can be done with qualitative data. I've mentioned now thematic analysis. I did want to mention grounded theory because the aim is to generate the theory from the data collection or generation process. So you're less interested in predetermined categories, you're less interested in an overarching theory that you might be using to read the data from. We probably all have in the back of our minds theories anyway. So I love, I do grounded theory quite a lot. It's one of my favourite things to do, is just to get myself immersed in the data. But I do have in the back of my minds anyway that I come from a feminist perspective, and I'm a social constructionist as well. So they're already going on in the back of my mind. So I'm not as if I'm reading the data without having that somehow playing. However, other theories, other social theories that I might use, I might not think about that initially. I might be just happy to launch in and see what comes up. Really important to keep good notes throughout this process, because the aim of it is to think about explanations, which is what a theory is, for the data as you're going through. So you do want to keep accurate records of what you're doing so that you can reflect on that and use that later on as well. And usually what you do here, and I'm going to give you an example to explain this, is begin your coding immediately. So you're not waiting for any predetermined themes that are coming through on your literature. You just begin to do this yourself, and from there you start to group into categories, look for similarities, do your contrasting. Some people call that open coding, some people call that initial coding. Kind of means the same thing, I think. And then other people call this go into what's called an axial coding, where you begin to do some refinement and you go from those very large, lots of categories, into developing subcategories or fewer categories. So you become then more selective in the third stage, and you come out with your core categories there as well. Now, your sources of data for this can be in-depth interviews, but this is also very good for biographical material, participant observations, media articles, newspaper stories, anything. Lots of ways in which you can have a grounded theory approach. And in actual fact, I noticed that lots of my honours students love to come from this perspective. They don't realise they're doing grounded theory, and nor did I when I was doing it the first time, but they just want to get in and see what the data is going to tell them rather than do the theory first. So what you're doing is you're sampling, you're collecting your data, you're now analysing it, and then you're repeating the process. And I just wanted to tell you a story of where I first used grounded theory. Didn't realise I was using grounded theory until I searched and found out that there was actually other people who developed a theory to explain the process that I was going through. So what I did was I wanted to examine the experience of women in the 20th century who belonged to a particular religious group. It's a Christian group, a Christian church, which was founded in the 19th century by a woman, an American woman. So it's a Christian Science church founded by Mary Baker Eddy in America. And so I did do some pre-reading, But mostly what I wanted to do, and that was mostly around the founder, but what I wanted to have a look at was women's experience. And so actually my pre-reading told me that nobody had really done that very much in terms of the 20th century. So there was a sizable gap in the literature. That was one thing. So the first thing I did was go to letters that women had been writing to the church over a 100-year period. And they were talking about their experiences. Now, this is a church that has an emphasis on spiritual healing. So many of those letters were about positive experiences, physical and otherwise, that women had experienced when they read the founder's book. So they experienced some sort of positive reaction, which they called healing in this tradition. So I read lots and lots of these letters, and this is where I did use NVivo, the computer program, because I read over 600 of them. And so to store them, be able to go back to them, categorize them, I scanned them all into this particular computer program. So that for that mass of data, that was a very helpful way of doing it. So that was great. So I was reading all these letters, but and I'm taking my notes and I'm thinking about it and I'm analysing the structure of the letter, and you can see the formula that comes through when you read enough of them. So I was doing all of that, doing that sort of categorising of the letters and the themes and the various physical ailments that people were talking about, and noticing that they didn't always talk about healing in terms of physical things. Sometimes it was about mental illness, and sometimes it was about adverse circumstances which were improved through their immersion in this particular church. What I noticed, however, and this is where the grounded theory comes in, what I found was that these were all positive stories of the religion. And what was missing was anything else that wasn't. And I had already, and through looking at these letters, I observed the decline in the number of them over the years. So it was pretty clear from the letters, as well as from some other reading I'd done, that there'd been a lack of interest the further you went into the 20th century of this particular religion. So on the one hand, what I had was this positive view of it, very, very positive. You'd wonder why, there weren't people just flocking to the church given the positive letters that women were writing. But on the other hand, there was this decline in the religion. So the other thing that I did, the other category, and this I didn't do this quite as neatly as this either. It just was written up that way. The other thing that I did was read a number of biographies and autobiographies of women who had been in the religion. And that began to complicate things a bit, because I did have some very positive stories again, but I had two other groups beginning to emerge. And those two groups were women who had completely left the religion, didn't want to have anything to do with it, thought it was very harsh, out of date, etc., really disillusioned, had disappeared. Some had gone to other religious groups, and some weren't having anything to do with religion whatsoever. And there, interestingly enough, there was then a third group, and these were women who still liked the ideas that Mary Baker Eddy had written about, but didn't like the church organisation. So they had left the church, but not the teaching. So that I now had three groups through doing this next group of reading, through reading published stories by women or about particular women. And then the third thing I did, which filled this out a whole lot more, was to go and interview women. And I chose to interview women in America because the majority of members of the church are women, and are Americans, and women for that matter. It is a woman-dominated religious tradition. So I went to America and I interviewed women across the country, all of which I set up beforehand, and interviewed these women. And that filled out that story, because once again what I did was interview very contemporary women who were in the church, women who had left the church completely, and one woman in particular who had left the church but had never left the teachings. And in fact, what she was doing was a leader, quite a subversive leader really, because she was publishing a whole lot of material about this particular these particular religious ideas, but outside of the authorised church. So she was a leader in that way. So by just going in and looking at the data, I developed, and in fact what I did, and through talking to the women, what I did was develop a theory of why this church had declined in the 20th century. And as I put all of that information together, along with some history of the church, what I found was that after the woman founder had died, then there was a male board of directors instituted, and that was state endorsed. That wasn't by the founder, didn't organise that. The American state had organised that. That was an all-male group of men running the church for many years, and they began to put into place some particular policies, and some of those policies ended up being very abusive. For example, that people weren't allowed to use any medical treatment if they were going to be using Christian Science spiritual treatment. So that sort of policy then created this quite repressive, controlling view of the church, and they didn't want women to publish their ideas and go outside of the church, as this woman leader that I was talking about did. So I had a very different view of this particular religious group after my study, and none of that had been recorded previously. So it was a very different research project that anybody had done on this religious group before, and that was all because I had decided, as I rather want to do anyway, just to get on with it and not so much think about the theories first. So that's one way of doing it. And then in terms of interpreting all of that data, I had sort of the grounded theory approach. I also used a standpoint theory because I was interested in women's experience, but there was a host of other theories that I needed to use as well on the way through, and I certainly read into philosophy and theology, etc. So there was a whole combination of them. So, in summary, qualitative data analysis is about making meaning from your data collection and getting it organised in a way that makes sense. And as I've been trying to say, human beings are always getting their data organised, even if it's organising their laundry, organising their bedroom, we're always getting organised. And there's not really a right and wrong way of doing that. You can do the coding in advance, the a priori coding, or it can be inductive as coming from your data. And again, there's no right or wrong way of doing that. What you're doing is looking for patterns. You're looking for what's said, but you're also looking for what is not said. And in that church example, what was being said all the time was listening to women in the church, and what wasn't said was the experience of women outside of it, and those who hadn't completely gone outside of it, that left the formal organisation but stayed within in terms of some of the teachings. And your final step then is that you'll interpret the patterns in your research in light of social theory. And that might be a theory that you generate, and it might be something that you use from somebody else's that works really well, and it could be a combination of both. So thanks for listening.